My name is Dr. Marcus Chen. I'm 53 years old, and I was born in Philadelphia to immigrant parents who sacrificed everything for my education. For the past 25 years, I've dedicated my life to cancer research at Johns Hopkins, believing that science could heal the world's deepest wounds. I never imagined that my greatest wound would come not from the disease I fought, but from the man I once called my closest friend and research partner. The Moscone Center in San Francisco buzzed with the electric energy of scientific ambition. 5,000 of the world's brightest medical minds had gathered for the International Medical Innovation Conference, their voices creating a symphony of hope and discovery that echoed through the gleaming halls. I stood in the back of the main auditorium, my hands trembling slightly, as I watched Dr. Richard Sterling approach the podium to accept the Humanitarian Innovation Award, an award that should have been mine. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, hidden in the shadows like a ghost at my own funeral, watching my former lab partner bask in the glory of work that had consumed 15 years of my life. The breakthrough cancer drug that Sterling Biotech had just brought to market, the one that was saving thousands of lives and generating billions in revenue, had been born in my lab, nurtured by my research, and inspired by my late wife Sarah's courageous battle with the very disease it now treated in 87% of patients. Rick looked every inch the successful CEO as he adjusted his Italian silk tie and smiled that practiced, camera-ready grin that had charmed investors and medical journalists alike. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his custom-tailored suit fitting his lean frame like armor. This was the same man who used to work 18-hour days beside me in our cramped laboratory, surviving on vending machine coffee and shared dreams of changing the world. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rick's voice boomed through the state-of-the-art sound system, "receiving this award is the culmination of a vision I've held since my early days as a researcher. When I first conceptualized the molecular pathway that would become SC47, I knew we were on the verge of something revolutionary." SC47. Even hearing him say the name felt like a knife twisting in my chest. I had named it after Sarah Chen, my wife, my partner, my inspiration. She had died in my arms 7 years ago, her body ravaged by the same aggressive form of pancreatic cancer that our drug now successfully treated in 87% of patients. Every late night in the lab, every failed experiment, every small breakthrough had been for her, a promise I had made to her hospital bed that her suffering wouldn't be in vain. The audience erupted in applause as Rick held up the Crystal Award, its faceted surface catching the stage lights and throwing rainbows across the walls. I felt my stomach lurch as Rick continued his acceptance speech, his words dripping with false humility and manufactured emotion. "Of course, no scientific breakthrough happens in isolation," Rick continued, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "We all stand on the shoulders of giants, and I'm no exception. Throughout my career, I've encountered many dedicated researchers, some more successful than others. Unfortunately, not everyone in academia has been able to adapt to the rigorous demands of modern pharmaceutical development. I've watched talented colleagues get left behind, their amateur attempts at innovation falling short of the commercial and clinical standards our patients deserve." The words hit me like a physical blow. Amateur attempts, left behind. The man who had once begged me to let him join my research team, who had spent countless hours poring over my notes and absorbing my methodologies, was now dismissing me as a has-been academic in front of the entire medical establishment. But it wasn't just Rick's betrayal that cut so deep. It was the deafening silence that followed. In that auditorium sat dozens of colleagues who knew the truth. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison from the National Cancer Institute, who had reviewed my early papers on the SC47 compound. Professor James Whitfield from Harvard, who had served on the peer review committee that had praised my initial findings. Dr. Angela Rodriguez from Memorial Sloan Kettering, who had personally thanked me for sharing my research protocols during her own studies. They all knew. They all sat there in their pressed conference attire, politely applauding, saying nothing. The complicity of their silence was almost worse than Rick's outright theft. In the world of academic medicine, reputation was everything. And with their silence, they were allowing mine to be systematically destroyed. As Rick launched into a detailed explanation of his research methodology that I had developed through years of painstaking trial and error, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. The grief that had defined me since Sarah's death, the quiet dignity with which I had tried to rebuild my career, the naive faith I had maintained in the integrity of the scientific community, all of it crystallized into something harder and colder. Something dark awakened in me that night, something I didn't know I was capable of. As Rick basked in his stolen glory, describing molecular pathways and therapeutic mechanisms that had cost me sleepless nights and countless failed experiments, I made a decision that would change everything. Rick Sterling had built his empire on my life's work, had turned my love letter to Sarah into his own commercial triumph, had dismissed me as irrelevant while standing on the foundation of my discoveries. He had taken everything from me, my research, my recognition, my legacy, and now my reputation. But he had made one critical mistake. In his arrogance, in his complete dismissal of the washed-up academic he had betrayed, he had underestimated exactly who he was dealing with. Rick might have forgotten the methodical, relentless researcher who had spent 15 years chasing an impossible cure, but I hadn't forgotten myself. As the applause died down and Rick left the stage, I remained in my seat, watching the crowd begin to disperse. Scientists chatted excitedly about the breakthrough, investors discussed market potential, and journalists scribbled notes about the inspiring story of innovation they had just witnessed. None of them realized they had just witnessed the opening scene of something much more dramatic, a systematic, methodical, and utterly devastating campaign that would expose every lie Rick had built his success on. The revenge I was planning wouldn't be quick or emotional. It would be precise, thorough, and absolutely merciless. I would use every connection I had built over 25 years in medical research, every skill I had developed in my pursuit of scientific truth, and every resource at my disposal. Rick Sterling thought he had won. He had no idea what was coming for him.
The flight back to Baltimore felt like traveling through a void. I stared out the airplane window at the cloud formations below, but all I could see was Rick's smug face accepting my award, dismissing my life's work with casual cruelty. The other passengers chatted about their conference experiences, their voices a dull buzz against the roar of engines and the storm building in my mind. My house in Guilford felt eerily quiet when I arrived. The silence that had once comforted me after Sarah's death now felt suffocating. I walked through rooms filled with memories, her reading chair by the window, the kitchen where we used to discuss my research over morning coffee, the home office where I'd spent countless evenings working on the very compounds that Rick had stolen. I found myself standing in front of our bedroom dresser, staring at the silver-framed photograph that had sustained me through the darkest years of grief. Sarah, at 38, radiant despite the chemotherapy, her dark eyes bright with the fierce determination that had defined our marriage. She had been a pediatric nurse before the cancer, spending her days caring for sick children while I worked in my laboratory trying to cure diseases like the one slowly killing her. How could I have been so wrong about him? I whispered to her photograph, my voice cracking with exhaustion and betrayal. You always said Rick was ambitious, but I thought he was my friend. The memories flooded back with painful clarity. Rick joining my research team 12 years ago as a postdoctoral fellow, eager and hungry for success. The late nights we'd spent together in the lab, testing compound after compound while Sarah underwent her treatments. The way he'd comforted me after her funeral, promising that we'd complete the work together, that her sacrifice wouldn't be forgotten. But even then, there had been signs I had chosen to ignore. The way Rick always seemed more interested in the commercial potential of our discoveries than their scientific elegance. His growing impatience with the peer review process, his constant pressure to rush clinical trials, his frustration with the bureaucratic barriers of the FDA approval process. When he'd left Hopkins 3 years ago to start Sterling Biotech, I'd supported his decision. I'd even agreed to serve as a consulting researcher, naively believing that our partnership would continue in a new form. Instead, Rick had used our shared research as the foundation for his company, systematically removing my name from patents and publications, rewriting the narrative of discovery to center himself as the brilliant innovator. The rage that consumed me in those first weeks after San Francisco was unlike anything I'd experienced. It burned through me like acid, keeping me awake at night and making it impossible to focus on anything else. I found myself obsessively reading news articles about Sterling Biotech's success, each glowing profile of Rick feeling like another knife wound. But gradually, the white-hot fury began to crystallize into something colder and more dangerous, a methodical determination that felt almost surgical in its precision. If Rick wanted to play in the big leagues of pharmaceutical politics, he was about to learn that I knew those rules better than he did. My first call was to Dr. Jennifer Walsh, my former doctoral student who now worked as a senior analyst at the FDA's Office of Scientific Investigations. Jenny had been in my lab during the early development of SC47, had co-authored several papers on its molecular mechanisms. Over coffee at a small cafe near the FDA building in Silver Spring, I outlined my concerns about potential research integrity violations at Sterling Biotech. Marcus, I've been wondering when someone would raise these questions. There have been irregularities in some of Sterling's submission documents, methodology descriptions that seem inconsistent with established protocols, timeline discrepancies that don't quite add up. I provided her with copies of my original research notes dating back to the initial synthesis of the compounds that would become SC47. The timestamps, the progression of experiments, the evolution of our hypothesis, all of it predated Rick's claimed timeline by more than 3 years. "This is damning evidence," she said, her eyes widening as she reviewed my documentation. "If what you're showing me is accurate, then Sterling Biotech's foundational patents may be based on fraudulent claims of invention." My next stop was David Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, an investigative journalist at the Wall Street Journal who specialized in pharmaceutical industry exposés. David had built his reputation by uncovering corporate malfeasance and scientific fraud, and he was hungry for his next big story. "I've been looking into Sterling Biotech for months," David admitted during our meeting at the Four Seasons in downtown Baltimore. "Something about their rapid success never quite added up. They went from startup to billion-dollar company in less than 3 years, but their published research pipeline was surprisingly thin for such dramatic breakthroughs. I shared selected portions of my evidence with David, enough to whet his appetite, without revealing the full scope of my campaign. Within weeks, he had begun reaching out to former Sterling employees, requesting documents through FOIA requests, and building the foundation for what would become a comprehensive investigation. The beauty of my approach was its apparent innocuity. To any outside observer, I was simply a concerned scientist raising legitimate questions about research integrity. My actions were professional, measured, and entirely within the bounds of acceptable academic discourse. But each step was carefully calculated to create maximum damage to Rick's empire. My network in the medical research community was extensive and deep. 25 years at Hopkins had connected me with researchers at every major institution in the country, with federal regulators, with journal editors, with the investment analysts who determine the flow of pharmaceutical capital. I began reaching out to these contacts, not with accusations, but with carefully phrased concerns and strategically shared information. Professor Margaret Stevens at Stanford had been a collaborator on early cancer metabolism research. When she mentioned during a conference call that her department was considering a partnership with Sterling Biotech, I simply shared my concerns about their research methodologies and suggested she might want to conduct additional due diligence. Within a month, Stanford had quietly withdrawn from discussions. Dr. Thomas Reed at the National Cancer Institute had oversight responsibility for several major research grants. When he asked for my opinion on a Sterling Biotech application for federal funding, I provided a detailed analysis highlighting methodological concerns and potential conflicts of interest. The application was subsequently rejected. Sarah Martinez, editor of the Journal of Clinical Oncology, had published several of my papers over the years. When Sterling Biotech submitted what appeared to be a rehash of my original SC47 research, Sarah reached out to me for peer review. My assessment was thorough, devastating, and entirely accurate. The paper was rejected for insufficient originality and methodological concerns. Each individual action seemed small, reasonable, the kind of professional oversight that kept the scientific community honest. But taken together, they were creating a pattern of doubt and scrutiny around Sterling Biotech that was beginning to affect the company's reputation and bottom line. The first major crack in Rick's facade came 6 months after San Francisco. Biopharma Weekly, the industry's most influential trade publication, ran a feature article titled "Questions Raised About Sterling Biotech's Research Claims." The piece, based largely on David Chen's investigation and the concerns raised by respected researchers in the field, didn't make direct accusations of fraud, but laid out a compelling case for further scrutiny. The impact of the article was immediate. Sterling Biotech's stock price dropped 12% in a single day. Major institutional investors began asking pointed questions about the company's intellectual property claims. Most importantly, the FDA announced it was launching a comprehensive review of Sterling's drug approval applications, focusing specifically on the authenticity of the underlying research data. Rick's response was predictable: arrogant, dismissive, and ultimately self-destructive. In a hastily arranged press conference, he dismissed the concerns as jealous attacks by failed academics who couldn't adapt to commercial science. He specifically mentioned certain researchers at traditional institutions who have struggled to remain relevant in modern pharmaceutical development. I watched the press conference from my office at Hopkins, a cold smile spreading across my face. Rick had just made his second critical mistake. He had escalated the conflict publicly, drawing even more attention to questions about his company's practices. That evening, I sat in my study, surrounded by files and documents that detailed 15 years of meticulous research. Sarah's photograph watched over me as I planned my next moves. The campaign I had launched was just beginning, but I could already see cracks forming in the empire Rick had taken from me.
Soon, those cracks would become a chasm that would swallow everything he had taken from me. The methodical, relentless researcher was just getting started.
The dominoes began falling faster than even I had anticipated. What started as whispered concerns in academic corridors had grown into a full-scale investigation that reached the highest levels of federal oversight. I watched from my office at Hopkins as Rick's empire crumbled, each new revelation more damning than the last. The turning point came when Dr. Patricia Hernandez, Sterling Biotech's former head of research and development, agreed to speak with federal investigators. Patricia had worked closely with Rick during the company's early days, and she possessed documentation that proved my original research had been systematically rebranded and repackaged as Sterling's proprietary discoveries. I had known Patricia since graduate school. She was brilliant, ethical, and had always harbored doubts about Rick's claims of innovation. When David Chen's Wall Street Journal investigation reached out to her, she initially declined to comment. But as the evidence mounted and her own conscience weighed on her, she made the decision that would seal Rick's fate. The SC-47 compound was fully developed before Rick even had access to the synthesis protocols, Patricia told the FDA investigators, according to sources who later spoke to David. I remember reviewing Dr. Chen's original research notes when I first joined Sterling. The molecular pathway, the therapeutic mechanisms, even the nomenclature. Everything Rick claimed as his own innovation had been documented in Marcus's lab years earlier. The FDA's investigation expanded rapidly once Patricia came forward. What had begun as a routine review of research integrity became a comprehensive criminal probe involving the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Department of Justice, and the Patent and Trademark Office. Sterling Biotech's offices in South San Francisco were raided on a gray Tuesday morning in March, with federal agents seizing computers, files, and research documentation. I was teaching my advanced molecular oncology seminar when my phone buzzed with the news alert. Sterling Biotech offices raided in federal fraud investigation. My students noticed my pause as I read the headline, but I simply continued the lecture on cellular apoptosis mechanisms, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. That evening, I allowed myself a small glass of the Macallan 25 that Sarah and I had been saving for a special occasion. As I sat in my study, watching the news coverage of federal agents carrying boxes of evidence from Sterling's headquarters, I raised the glass to her photograph. It's beginning, sweetheart. Justice is finally beginning. The revelations that emerged over the following weeks were staggering in their scope. Sterling Biotech hadn't just stolen my SC-47 research. They had built their entire corporate foundation on plagiarized work from multiple researchers. Rick had systematically identified promising early-stage research at academic institutions, recruited key personnel from those labs, and then rebranded their discoveries as Sterling's innovations. The financial implications were catastrophic for Rick's investors. Sterling Biotech stock, which had peaked at $347 per share just 8 months earlier, plummeted to under $12 as institutional investors fled. Major pharmaceutical companies that had signed licensing deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars began initiating legal proceedings to recover their investments. The company's board of directors, led by Margaret Thornton, called an emergency meeting to discuss Rick's future. I learned about Rick's termination through a terse press release issued on a Friday afternoon, the traditional time for corporate announcements that companies hope will be buried in weekend news cycles. Sterling Biotech announces leadership transition as Dr. Richard Sterling steps down to address personal matters. The company remains committed to its mission of innovative pharmaceutical development. Personal matters. The euphemism was almost amusing in its inadequacy. Rick wasn't dealing with personal matters. He was facing federal fraud charges that could result in decades in prison, civil suits that would consume any remaining assets, and the complete destruction of his professional reputation. But my own vindication was equally swift and comprehensive. The International Medical Innovation Committee, clearly embarrassed by their previous year's award ceremony, reached out to my office with an invitation to accept the Humanitarian Innovation Award that should have been mine from the beginning. The Journal of Clinical Oncology published a detailed retrospective on the true development of SC47, with my research properly credited and my contributions fully acknowledged. The American Association for Cancer Research went even further, announcing that their annual meeting would feature a special symposium titled The SC47 Discovery, a study in scientific innovation and integrity, with me as the keynote speaker. Universities that had previously overlooked my contributions began reaching out with offers of prestigious endowed chairs and research positions. Standing at the podium in the McCormick Place Convention Center in Chicago, looking out at 3,000 oncologists and researchers, I felt a complex mix of vindication and melancholy. This recognition, this acknowledgement of my life's work, it should have happened years ago, when Sarah was still alive to share in the triumph. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the vast auditorium. "Scientific discovery is built on trust, collaboration, and the shared commitment to advancing human knowledge. When that trust is violated, when discovery is stolen and repackaged for personal gain, we don't just harm individual researchers, we undermine the entire foundation of medical progress." The applause was thunderous, sustained, and deeply satisfying. But even as I accepted the recognition that was rightfully mine, I couldn't shake the awareness of what this victory had cost me. The past 18 months hadn't been spent in my laboratory pursuing new discoveries that might help future patients. Instead, I had devoted my time and energy to an elaborate campaign of professional destruction. The irony wasn't lost on me. In my pursuit of justice for stolen research, I had effectively stolen time from my own scientific work. The methodical, relentless focus that had made me a successful researcher had been redirected toward revenge, and while that revenge had been complete and satisfying, it had come at the expense of the work that truly mattered to me. The final blow to Rick's empire came in the form of criminal charges filed by federal prosecutors in the Northern District of California. The 37-page indictment detailed a pattern of fraud, patent theft, and securities violations that painted Rick not as a misguided entrepreneur, but as a systematic criminal who had built his wealth on stolen intellectual property. Dr. Sterling engaged in a deliberate and sophisticated scheme to defraud investors, research institutions, and the American public, announced U.S. Attorney Sarah Kim at a press conference covered by every major news outlet. His actions not only violated federal law, but undermined the integrity of medical research that affects millions of patients worldwide. Sterling Biotech filed for bankruptcy protection within days of the criminal charges being announced. The company's assets were frozen, its research operations suspended, and its remaining employees left to find new positions in an industry that now viewed them with suspicion simply by association with Rick's fraudulent enterprise. I should have felt triumph in that moment, watching the complete destruction of the empire Rick had built on my stolen work. But part of me did. The part that had been humiliated in San Francisco, dismissed as a washed-up academic, forced to watch in silence as my life's work was credited to a thief. But another part of me, the scientist who had spent decades in pursuit of knowledge and healing, recognized the hollow nature of this victory. Rick Sterling's downfall was complete and deserved, but it had required me to become something I never wanted to be. A destroyer rather than a creator, a force of vengeance rather than discovery. As I sat in my study that evening, surrounded by newspaper clippings documenting Rick's fall of grace, I stared at Sarah's photograph and wondered what she would think of the man I had become. The methodical, complete campaign I had waged was brilliant in its execution and devastating in its effectiveness, but it had consumed nearly 2 years of my life. 2 years that could have been spent on research that might help other families avoid the loss we had experienced. The empire had fallen, justice had been served, and my reputation had been restored. But the taste of victory was more bitter than sweet, colored by the recognition that revenge, no matter how justified, came with its own profound costs.
The knock on my door came on a rainy Thursday evening in November, nearly 2 years after that devastating conference in San Francisco. I was in my study, reviewing grant applications for the newly established Sarah Chen Memorial Cancer Research Foundation, when I heard the hesitant tap against the wood. Through the peephole, I saw a figure I barely recognized, gaunt, hollow-eyed, wearing a wrinkled coat that looked like it had seen better days. Rick Sterling stood on my doorstep, transformed from the confident CEO who had once stolen my life's work into something resembling a broken man. His silver hair, once perfectly styled for television appearances, now hung limp and unkempt. The expensive suits had been replaced by worn khakis and a threadbare sweater. Most striking were his eyes. The arrogant gleam had been replaced by something desperate and haunted. I opened the door slowly, studying the man who had once been my closest research partner and had become my most hated enemy. We stood there for a moment in silence, the rain pattering on my porch roof, both of us aware that this confrontation had been inevitable from the moment his empire began to crumble. "Hello, Marcus," he said, finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "May I come in?" I stepped aside without speaking, gesturing for him to enter. Rick walked into my living room with the careful movements of a man who had learned not to take anything for granted. His eyes swept over the familiar space, the leather chairs where we had once discussed research strategies, the built-in bookshelves lined with medical journals, the photographs of Sarah that still occupied places of honor throughout the room. "You look well," he said, settling into the chair across from where I remained standing. "Success suits you." I poured myself a bourbon from the bar cart, deliberately not offering him one. "What do you want, Rick?" His laugh was bitter and hollow. "Straight to the point. I always respected that about you." He rubbed his face with hands that trembled slightly. "I suppose you know about the criminal trial. It starts in 3 weeks." I knew. Everyone in our industry knew. The federal prosecutors had assembled an airtight case, with Patricia Hernandez serving as their star witness and my original research documentation providing the foundation for fraud charges that could result in 20 years in federal prison. Rick's legal team had tried every possible strategy, challenging the evidence, questioning the investigators' methods, even attempting to argue that academic collaboration made ownership claims ambiguous. None of it had worked. The truth was too clear, the evidence too comprehensive, the pattern of theft too systematic to dismiss or explain away. "I also suppose you know that Margaret filed for divorce last month?" He referred to his wife of 15 years. "She's taking the house in Marin County, what's left of our investments, custody of Emma and David. Not that there's much left for her to take." I remained silent, sipping my bourbon and studying the man who had once shared my dreams of changing the world through medical research. Part of me felt a flicker of sympathy. Rick had children, a family that was suffering for his crimes. But that sympathy was quickly overwhelmed by memories of Sarah's final days, of the research that might have saved her
if Rick hadn't delayed its development by stealing credit and diverting resources toward his corporate ambitions. The lawyers say I'm looking at 15 to 20 years. Federal minimum security, but still, I'll be 73 when I get out, assuming I survive that long. My kids will be adults who remember their father as a criminal. My professional reputation is destroyed beyond any possibility of rehabilitation. He leaned forward in his chair, his eyes pleading. Marcus, you're the only person who can help me now. If you were to speak to the prosecutors, to explain that our collaboration was more complex than the charges suggest, that there were gray areas in our research partnership. Gray areas? I set down my glass with deliberate care, feeling the familiar cold anger beginning to build. Is that what you call 15 years of my research that you systematically rebranded as your own innovation? It wasn't like that, he protested, but his voice lacked conviction. We were partners. We worked together. The boundaries of individual contribution weren't always clear. Stop. The word came out sharper than I intended. Don't insult my intelligence with revisionist history. You know exactly what you did. You took research I developed before you even joined my team, research inspired by my wife's battle with cancer, research that represented the culmination of my entire career. You didn't just steal my work, Rick, you stole my legacy, my contribution to the fight against the disease that killed the woman I loved. Rick's composure finally cracked. Tears began streaming down his cheeks as he buried his face in his hands. I know. God help me, I know what I did. I convinced myself at first that I was just maximizing the commercial potential of our discoveries, that bringing SC47 to market faster would help more patients. But somewhere along the way, it became about the recognition, the wealth, the power. He looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. I'll make a full public confession. I'll admit to everything, the theft, the fraudulent patents, the lies I told investors and regulators. I'll make sure the world knows that you're the true innovator behind SC47. But please, Marcus, speak to the prosecutors. Ask them to consider a plea deal that doesn't destroy what's left of my life. I walked to the window, looking out at the rain falling on my carefully maintained garden. Sarah had planted those roses during her final spring, insisting that beauty should outlast the darkness that was consuming her. Now they bloomed year after year, a reminder that some things endure beyond individual human tragedy. Do you remember what you said to me at the conference in San Francisco? About amateur attempts by has-been academics? About colleagues who couldn't adapt to commercial science? The silence stretched between us, filled only with the sound of rain against the windows and Rick's quiet sobs. You made your bed, Rick. Now lie in it. His face crumpled with the finality of my rejection. Please, he whispered. I have children. I have a family. I'm begging you. So did I replied, my voice steady, despite the turmoil in my chest. I had a wife who died while you delayed the development of compounds that might have saved her. I had a research legacy that you systematically destroyed for your profit. I had a reputation that you demolished with casual cruelty in front of my peers. Rick stood up slowly, understanding that his last desperate gambit had failed. At the door he paused and looked back at me one final time. I'm sorry, Marcus. For whatever it's worth, I'm truly sorry for what I did to you and Sarah's memory. Your apologies don't resurrect the dead, and they don't restore the years you stole from science in service of your greed. After he left, I sat in my darkened living room for hours, staring at Sarah's photograph and wrestling with the complex emotions that Rick's visit had stirred up. I had achieved everything I had set out to accomplish. Rick's empire was destroyed, his reputation was ruined, his freedom was forfeit. Justice had been served with a thoroughness that exceeded even my most optimistic projections. But victory, I discovered, tasted far more bitter than I had anticipated. The methodical campaign I had waged over the past 2 years had consumed enormous amounts of time and emotional energy. While I had been orchestrating Rick's downfall, other researchers had continued pushing the boundaries of cancer treatment. New discoveries had been made, new compounds developed, new hope offered to patients and families facing the same battle that Sarah and I had fought. I had won my war against Rick Sterling, but in doing so, I had temporarily abandoned the larger war against the disease that had taken my wife. The irony was inescapable. In my pursuit of justice for stolen research, I had stolen time from the work that truly mattered. 3 weeks later, I watched the news coverage of Rick's sentencing from my office at Hopkins. The judge had sentenced him to 18 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 12 years. Sterling Biotech's remaining assets were being liquidated to compensate investors and fund ongoing patient treatment programs. Rick's name had been removed from every patent, every publication, every award he had fraudulently claimed.
The victory was complete, but as I watched Rick being led away in handcuffs, I felt no triumph, only a profound emptiness, and the recognition that revenge, no matter how justified, came with costs that couldn't be calculated in advance. The empire had fallen, the thief had been punished, and justice had been served. But the question that haunted me as I turned away from the television was simple and devastating. What kind of man had I become in my pursuit of that justice? And was the price I had paid worth the victory I had achieved?
Spring arrived early that year, and with it came a clarity I hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. I was standing in the construction site that would soon become the Sarah Chen Memorial Cancer Research Institute, watching workers install the final pieces of specialized laboratory equipment. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like microscopic representations of hope itself. 8 months had passed since Rick's sentencing, and I had spent that time engaged in the most meaningful work of my career. The foundation I had established in Sarah's name had attracted some of the brightest young researchers in oncology, drawn by our mission to develop treatments for the most aggressive and treatment-resistant cancers. Unlike the corporate-driven research that had characterized Rick's approach, our work would be guided purely by scientific curiosity and the desire to heal. Dr. Maria Santos, a brilliant postdoctoral researcher from Memorial Sloan Kettering, was reviewing patient data on her tablet when I approached. "The preliminary results from the Phase 1 trials are remarkable, Dr. Chen," she said, her voice filled with the excitement that reminded me why I had fallen in love with research in the first place. "The modified SC47 compounds are showing efficacy in pancreatic cancer cases that were previously considered terminal. We might be looking at survival rate improvements of 40 to 50%. Pancreatic cancer, the same disease that had taken Sarah. The irony wasn't lost on me that the research Rick had stolen and commercialized was now, in its evolved form, offering hope to patients with the very condition that had inspired its original development. But this time, the work was being done right, with proper attribution, ethical protocols, and a focus on patient outcomes rather than profit margins. "Schedule a meeting with the Clinical Trials Committee," I told Maria. "If these results hold up under scrutiny, we'll move to Phase 2 trials by the end of the year." As Maria walked away to prepare her presentation, I found myself standing alone in what would soon be the Institute's main laboratory. The space was beautiful in its functionality. Clean lines, state-of-the-art equipment, and enough workspace for a team of 20 researchers to pursue their investigations. But what made it special wasn't the technology or the design, it was the purpose that would drive the work conducted here. I pulled Sarah's photograph from my jacket pocket, the same silver-framed image that had watched over me through the darkest years of grief and the most intense months of my campaign against Rick. Her smile was as radiant as ever, her eyes bright with the compassion that had defined her life as a pediatric nurse. For so long, this photograph had been a symbol of loss, a reminder of everything cancer had taken from me. Now, as I placed it carefully on the windowsill of what would be my new office, it felt like something different, a symbol of continuity, of love that transcends individual mortality, of purpose that outlasts personal tragedy. "We did it, sweetheart," I whispered to her image. "Not the way I originally planned, but we did it. Your suffering wasn't in vain, and neither was mine." The revenge I had pursued against Rick Sterling had consumed nearly 2 years of my life, but it had also taught me something valuable about the nature of justice and the cost of anger. Rick was now serving his sentence in federal prison, his reputation destroyed, his family broken, his dreams reduced to ashes. I had achieved everything I had set out to accomplish, but the victory had left me empty rather than fulfilled. True satisfaction, I had discovered, came not from destroying those who had wronged me, but from building something that honored the memory of those I had loved. The Sarah Chen Memorial Cancer Research Institute would be Rick's legacy as well as mine, not because he deserved recognition, but because his theft had ultimately led to the creation of something more important than either of our individual ambitions. That evening, I sat in my study at home, surrounded by boxes of documents I had accumulated during my campaign against Rick. Correspondence with journalists, evidence files, legal documents, newspaper clippings documenting his downfall. The paper trail of a methodical campaign that had achieved its objectives with devastating effectiveness. I had kept everything, initially as a form of evidence, then as a kind of trophy. But now, looking at the accumulated detritus of my pursuit of revenge, I felt only a desire to be free of it. The man who had obsessed over Rick Sterling's destruction was not the man I wanted to be moving forward. The fire in my backyard burned hot and bright as I fed it box after box of documents. Each page that turned to ash represented a piece of anger that I was finally ready to release. The correspondence with David Chan about his Wall Street Journal investigation, the careful notes I had made about Rick's psychological vulnerabilities, the strategic planning documents that had guided my systematic dismantling of Sterling Biotech. All of it went into the flames, creating a cleansing ritual that felt both necessary and cathartic. The only documents I kept were my original research notes on SC-47, not as evidence of theft, but as the foundation for the continued development of treatments that might help future patients. Those notes, stained with coffee and marked with Sarah's occasional comments from the evenings in which she had helped me review my work, would form the basis for the next generation of compounds we would develop at the Institute. As the last of the revenge-related documents burned, I found myself thinking about forgiveness, not for Rick, whose actions remain unforgivable, but for myself. I had spent years consumed by anger and grief, first over Sarah's death, then over Rick's betrayal. That anger had motivated me to achieve something remarkable, the complete exposure of systematic fraud and the restoration of scientific integrity. But it had also cost me years of my life that could have been spent in more productive pursuits. The challenge now was learning to forgive myself for the time I had lost, for the research I hadn't conducted while orchestrating Rick's downfall, for becoming a destroyer rather than a creator during those dark months of my campaign. Standing in my backyard, watching the last embers of my revenge files fade to nothing, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. A sense of lightness, of possibility, of a future unconstrained by the anger and pain of the past. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, my former student at the FDA, called me the next morning with news that would have thrilled me during my revenge phase, but now felt like a postscript to a closed chapter.
"Marcus, I thought you should know that Rick Sterling attempted suicide in his prison cell last week," she said, her voice heavy with concern. "He's in stable condition now, but the psychological evaluation suggests he's not adapting well to incarceration." I absorbed this information with surprising equanimity. A year ago, news of Rick's despair would have filled me with satisfaction. Now I felt only a distant sadness for the waste of human potential and the ripple effects of his choices on his innocent family members. "I appreciate you telling me, Jenny, but Rick Sterling's fate is no longer my concern. I have more important work to focus on." And I did. The Sarah Chen Memorial Cancer Research Institute was scheduled to open in 6 weeks, with a staff of 15 researchers and a budget that would allow us to pursue the kind of long-term, patient-focused investigations that represented the best of medical science. We would be announcing our first major grant awards at a ceremony that would bring together some of the most respected oncologists in the world. More importantly, we would be starting Phase 2 clinical trials for our improved SC47 compounds, offering hope to patients with pancreatic, ovarian, and liver cancers that had previously been considered untreatable. The work that Sarah's illness had inspired, that Rick's greed had corrupted, was finally free to fulfill its true purpose: healing rather than profit, service rather than recognition. As I prepared for the Institute's opening ceremony, I found myself thinking about the cyclical nature of scientific progress. My original research had been stolen and commercialized, leading to treatments that saved lives but enriched a thief. That theft had motivated a campaign of destruction that restored justice but consumed years of my life. Now that same research was being developed in a new context, free from the constraints of corporate greed and focused purely on its healing potential. Sarah would have appreciated the poetry of it all, how love and loss and anger and justice had combined to create something larger than any individual contribution. The institute bearing her name would outlast both Rick's crimes and my revenge, serving patients and advancing knowledge long after both of us were forgotten. Standing at the podium during the Institute's opening ceremony, looking out at an audience of researchers, patients, and philanthropists who shared our vision of ethical, patient-focused cancer research, I felt a profound sense of completion. Not the hollow completion of achieved revenge, but the deeper satisfaction of purpose aligned with values. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice steady and filled with genuine hope for the first time in years, "we gather today not to mourn what has been lost, but to celebrate what can be built. The Sarah Chen Memorial Cancer Research Institute represents a commitment to the highest ideals of medical science: integrity, collaboration, and an unwavering focus on healing rather than profit." The applause was warm and sustained, but what moved me most was the expression on the faces in the audience.
Here were people who understood that scientific progress required not just brilliant minds and advanced technology, but also ethical foundations and a genuine commitment to human welfare. As I concluded my remarks and stepped away from the podium, I caught sight of Sarah's photograph, now permanently installed in a place of honor in the Institute's lobby. Her smile seemed to convey approval, not just for the research center that bore her name, but for the man I had finally become. No longer defined by loss or driven by anger, but motivated by hope and dedicated to building rather than destroying. The future stretched ahead, full of possibilities I couldn't yet imagine. There would be new compounds to develop, new treatments to test, new hope to offer families facing the same battle that Sarah and I had fought. The work would be challenging and sometimes heartbreaking, but it would also be pure in its purpose and clear in its moral direction. For the first time since Sarah's death, I was ready to embrace that future, not as a widowed man consumed by grief and rage, but as a scientist recommitted to the healing power of knowledge and the enduring strength of love that survives even the deepest losses. The revenge was over. The real work was just beginning.